All and welcome to the second episode of Behind the Cycle. And this week, and once every 4 weeks or 4 episodes heretofore, we're very lucky to have the legendary Te Pou, who I've known since I was young and we were both younger and fresher and dumber. But it's great to see you, mate, and particularly for this episode.
Yeah, great. Look, we had a couple of great interviews with Willie Jackson and Dr. Vincent O'Malley. Look, in the wider public, Willie Jackson is seen as a bit of a radical, but he's not actually. He's very moderate in his approach. He's a builder. You know, him and his mother built Whare, which is an urban marae, one of the first urban maraes in Tamaki, Auckland, and the Manukau Urban Māori Authority. And, you know, Phil, COVID and the vaccination was very important. And if it wasn't for people like Willie Jackson, love him or loathe him, John Tamahere, people that you may not know nationally from Papakura Marae and other marae, urban marae in Auckland, it would have been a very different outcome. You know, Willie is a community builder, and you know, he works across Māori Domain Park here. Vincent O'Malley, a great New Zealand historian. I love reading his books. Me and my kids watch his work with Mihi Ford and Annabelle Lee Mather on New Zealand wards. It just brings it to the reality of it, and in a medium that we can watch and learn about quite easily. So, you know, these are the type of New Zealanders that we need to be listening as we have this debate about Te Tiriti, but the debate needs to be one that we need to understand the fundamentals. And Te Tiriti is about partnership. And the preamble made that very clear in terms of the protection of and rangatira-tanga. So, you know, it's a very timely podcast in an unsettling time, Phil.
Yeah, it is. And I think what Vincent O'Malley in particular drew attention to is that his and your and my interpretation of what the treaty means, what it meant at the time, how it was understood at the time. These are not controversial, particularly debates among people that study these things for a living. So what we're dealing with in David Seymour is a demagogue who is either willfully maintaining ignorance on these subjects, or he's lying. There's no good explanation for the anachronistic, ahistorical nonsense that he's spouting in the service of this Treaty Principles Bill. And I think between them, one historian, one politician with an activist background like Willie Jackson, and again, you're right. If you're listening to this and you think Willie Jackson's radical, let me introduce you to a couple of members of his whānau. Sid Jackson being one, Moana Jackson being another, right? I mean, Willie Jackson is a bridge builder, and that's and as well as a pragmatic grassroots activist, and both of them bring a really valuable perspective to this episode, and I hope people get as much out of it as I think you and I did.
Phil, I know our time is limited, but I want to say this. I believe that the politician that is most at threat over all of this is the Prime Minister, the rangatira. His mid-support, his support base will be worried about this. They'll be worried about the inflammatory nature of it, and they will want to see some sort of leadership. And, you know, I've been going off and on the Waitangi for the last 25 years. I'm up there again from the 4th to the 6th. It's going to be very heated. Shane Jones said that life will go on past the 6th of February. I don't think so. I think that there's a movement that was born out of Tūranga Waiwai that will go on, and we'll see this very small portion of our history done away with, and life then getting back to normal. Or some form.
Tell us about you. You were there, weren't you, at the Hui? Tell us about that. What was it? How did it feel to you?
It was a great Hui. I was astounded by the two things: the numbers, but also the diversity. You know, we had former National Party prime ministers. We had former governor generals, both Pākehā, by the way. We had leaders of business, both Māori and non-Māori. We had Mongrel Mob whānau, we had Black Power whānau, but the Wairua encapsulated us all. What I left the hui with was this, that actually optimism, hope, and love. And isn't it amazing, Phil? Folks that are often the most disadvantaged in life are the ones that are most full of optimism, love, and hope. They're not gripers and they're not moaners. And, I see this all the time. I don't want to get off track too much, but, if you interview people on budget day in Otara or Cannons Creek, they'll say one thing: I hope there's more in it for my whānau and my community. They never talk about themselves.
Yeah. Well, I think it's almost a truism to say that people that have endured genuine suffering and have overcome great struggles are optimistic by necessity, right? Whereas the anger and vitriol you see on the part of some Pākehā who want to bring about another race war, that actually arises from no understanding of suffering. Or at least their idea of suffering as a lukewarm flat white. And you don't. That's where the anger comes from. It's not from Māori. So it'll be fascinating to see. I think I've seen no evidence whatsoever that Luxon understands the first thing about what he's got himself into.
No.
I just honestly believe he has blundered into territory that he is woefully unable to comprehend.
He's like a little piglet that's got a ring in his nose, and he's being led to a place that he's not sure of by David Seymour, who is a savvy politician. But at the end of the day, National Party by and large is a party of liberal moderates, and I think that he will suffer if he doesn't get on top of this, and focus on what he keeps on telling us is the most important issue, and that's the economy. But there's little corridor about the economy in the last month or so.
That's right, and I'll tell you what we don't need from an economic point of view is a period of sustained unrest arising from a needless, pointless debate over so-called treaty principles. That's the last thing we need if we want to find prosperity and deliver the kind of economy that he's promising that he will. So look, I think this is obviously a high stakes, high emotion set of issues that really are a baptism of fire for a prime minister whose lack of experience, deep knowledge, understanding of our history and our politics has really not, has been underreported.
That's right.
I think he's got away with presenting as Mr. Capable CEO.
Yes.
But the more he comes under pressure, the more that absence of knowing where the bodies are buried, of understanding where the landmines are, of all that stuff that John Key and Helen Clark and Bill English understand to their fingertips, that stuff's missing with Luxon. And I think this issue therefore is a really a very tricky minefield for a guy with no sideways step.
So anyway, whānau, enjoy the interviews.
Yep, enjoy it. And it's a bit longer than the 1 hour overall, but I think you'll agree at the end of it that it was worth taking the time to speak to our two excellent guests, beginning with, even though we didn't record it in this order, but beginning with the brilliant New Zealand historian, Dr. Vincent O'Malley.
Kia ora.
Kia ora, everyone. We're very lucky to have Shane and I today as our guest, the esteemed New Zealand historian, an unrivaled, or rivaled by few at least, expert on the New Zealand wars, in particular groundbreaking work around the Waikato War, but even more generally, a powerful and persuasive voice on New Zealand history, Dr. Vincent O'Malley. Great to see you, Vincent.
Thank you. Kia ora.
Kia ora. The reason, I mean, I'm a big fan of your work anyway, but I saw a comment you made on social media, who knows, a week, 2 weeks ago, responding to the Ministry of Justice comments on the proposed David Seymour Treaty Principles Bill, where you said, and I hope you don't mind, I'm going to quote your tweet, "Good on the Ministry of Justice, public servants involved, for pointing out that Act's proposed principles bear no relationship to the actual contents of Te Tiriti."
That's right.
Yeah. So I'll ask you to expound on that, but I just want to ask, rather than give an elaborate introduction of your stunning body of work, I'm going to invite listeners to go out and look for everything Dr. O'Malley's done. He's an outstanding historian. And one of the key themes I've gleaned from your work relates to this question of memory, how we remember or choose not to remember aspects of our history. I'm a great fan of an American historian called David Blight, who works on memory and history as it relates to the US Civil War, which I know Shane's a big fan of as well. And of course, in the case of the US Civil War, it's about the lost cause doctrine, about how events of that era have been recast for political purposes. But a lot of your work has reflected on not so much how we've remembered the New Zealand wars, but the fact that we really haven't remembered them at all. You've used the phrase even historical amnesia. To what extent, Dr. O'Malley, do you think historical amnesia has made this Treaty Principles Bill, this ACT campaign, possible to begin with?
Well, I think generations of New Zealanders have grown up without any real knowledge of our country's history. And if you lack that basic awareness of where you come from, you're in no position to critically assess this kind of misinformation that's contained in that document in terms of the Act's Treaty Principles Bill. And so engaging with that history in a meaningful way enables people to see through it. And, large numbers of people were denied that opportunity in their school years. And that's why the decision, Jacinda Ardern's announcement in September 2019, that all students would learn New Zealand history at school is so significant. And I argue that in the long term, it's probably the most transformative decision that Labor government made, because it would mean that we would break the cycle of historical ignorance in this country, and future generations would be in a position to see through bullshit like this, basically.
Yeah. So for people that did miss out, and I include myself in that number, even though I've got a history degree, and even though I had Jamie Ballich as my first year university lecturer, even then I could tell you more about the English Civil War, the US Civil War, events in Australia, more than I could about New Zealand. I completely own up to that. And I think we all can to some extent. But for somebody that has missed out on that education, what are the key facts of that history? Let's get back to basics. What are the key facts that impinge on our understanding of let's focus on the treaty for today's purposes, that people are missing? What do people need to know?
Well, I suppose the big one, as the Waitangi Tribunal has found, Māori did not cede sovereignty in 1840.
No.
And that's clear. Article 1 of Te Tiriti, Māori ceded kawanatanga, governance or government, to the Crown. And that's something less than sovereignty. The interesting thing is, 5 years earlier, a number of Northern Rangatira signed a document called He Whakaputanga o Te Rangatiratanga o Nui Te Rene, the Declaration of the Independence of New Zealand. And the word used in that for independence was rangatiratanga.
Right.
And the phrase used in that document for sovereign power was mana i te whenua. Now, if either of those phrases, mana or rangatiratanga, had been included in Article 1 of Te Tiriti, Māori would never have signed it. And that was probably why Henry Williams, who did understand Te Reo Māori very well, didn't use those terms. He used a much softer term, kawanatanga, which didn't convey the fact that sovereignty was being transferred, because from Henry Williams' perspective, it was in the best interest of Māori that they agreed to this deal, because he decided that it was necessary for the Crown to intervene in New Zealand. And so there was some massaging of the message in there. And so consequently, the contents of the English translation of that, again, they don't reflect the contents of what Māori actually agreed to, what they signed up to in 1840. And that's not a contentious argument that I'm making. That's one historians, there's consensus on that, basically. It's not a contentious point either.
If we reflect, sorry, go ahead, Shane.
And there was an interpretation from Doctor Who Kafaru that said that Māori had no experience or cultural understanding of the concept of giving away their rangatiratanga, because it didn't belong to them as an individual. It belonged to the hapu and the iwi.
Yeah, well, that's right. And so in terms of what, the other aspect of this as well, and I think this is a thing that a lot of people don't understand, is that after Te Tiriti is signed in 1840, over most of the country, nothing changes on the ground.
Yep.
In Waikato and on the East Coast, in the Urawera or whatever, life just went on as it had before. Te Tiriti didn't change anything immediately. And so the Crown's conception of the treaty as a treaty of cession only really, I'd suggest, becomes a reality from the 1860s onwards. And that's why, in order to understand the treaty, you need to understand the New Zealand Wars and that long history of what your old history lecturer, Jamie Ballard, referred to as converting nominal sovereignty into substantive sovereignty. Mm-hmm. So in 1840, the Crown thought on paper they had this, but they knew that they didn't. They were in no position to impose their will on any Māori community. The first governor, William Hobson, had 100 troops for the whole of the country.
Right.
And he was confronted with 100,000 Māori. Now, what was he supposed to do with 100 troops? He was not going to conquer anywhere. He was not going to impose his will on any community. And that's why for a long period, Māori remained all-powerful. And, large numbers of settlers who turned up in the country, those settlers who travelled halfway around the world to New Zealand, they arrived with an ingrained set of assumptions. And one of them was that they were at the apex of their own imagined racial hierarchy. They expected to be in charge. And they arrived in Aotearoa and they discovered that Māori were in charge. Even after the 6th of February 1840, that didn't really change things. And you have Māori dominating the economy. They own most of the lands, the best lands. And this resentment builds up. But the settlers aren't powerful enough to change that for a long time. And a key turning point, I think, is 1858. And that's when Māori are outnumbered in their own country for the first time ever. And it's no coincidence that within 2 years of that, you get the start of the main sequence of the New Zealand Wars at Waitangi in March 1860, and those wars carry on for the next 12 years. And it's through that critical period that the Crown gains the ability to coerce communities. It gains those substantive powers that it assumed that it had gained in 1840.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's fascinating history. You noted the other day I saw that even in the UK, 12 years after the treaty was signed, there was a constitution, New Zealand Constitution Act. I think I'm right in saying. Was that the name of the? Yeah. Tell us about how that helps us understand. I guess we've talked a bit about what Māori thought they were getting into. What does that tell us about what the Crown, well, at least Parliament, believed a dozen years after the signing? Yeah,
well, this is a really interesting story. So, as soon as the settlers start arriving in New Zealand after 1840, they start demanding the right to self-government, the ability to govern their own affairs, because effectively the governor is in charge. He's running the colony. So 1846, you get the first Constitution Act passed, and that provides for Parliament to be established. But one of the qualifications for the ability to vote was not just being a male over the age of 21, but you also needed to be able to read and write in English. Now, at this time, Māori had higher literacy rates than the settlers, but in Te Reo Māori, not English. So the effect of that would have been to exclude Māori men from the right to vote at a time when Māori was still overwhelmingly the majority of the population. Now, George Grey had just arrived for his first governorship of New Zealand. He told the British government, there's no way I can implement this provision. Every iwi in the country will rise up against us if we do. So he got it shelved for 5 years. So 1852, the British Parliament had to pass a new Constitution Act. And this time they don't have an English language qualification, but they do introduce a property qualification. Now, that would have been no problem for most iwi if lands held under customary title were included in that. But the property qualification was based on the notion that you had to have a piece of paper from the Crown to say you owned this piece of land. Right. And most Māori didn't have that. They held their lands under native title. So most Māori would have been excluded from the franchise under that. And again, they're still the majority of the population. But the British parliamentarians assumed that large numbers of Māori wouldn't be subject to the authority of the New Zealand Parliament because they included another provision in the 1852 New Zealand Constitution Act, and that was Section 71. And that provided for districts to be declared in which native customs, laws and usages would continue. So in effect, what this would do would be to give legal status to the de facto situation on the ground. So in those places where Māori still managed to govern their own affairs as they always had, they would receive legal recognition of their right to do that. And so in that way, the parliament that was set up would govern the affairs of settlers, and most Māori communities, other than those living in European townships, would manage their own affairs as they always had. Now, the British parliamentarians assumed that would be a temporary expedient until such time as Māori were sufficiently civilised, quote unquote, in order to participate in the General Assembly. But these things, once they're set up, they can be quite difficult to disestablish. So I think that could have been a significant moment. The problem was that Governors Gore Brown and George Grey had no inclination whatsoever to implement Section 71. So you had Parliament set up. Its jurisdiction was extended over the entire country, and no native districts are declared. And the Colonial Office was, they were kind of confused as to why this provision was never implemented, especially in the early 1860s when you've got the Kingitanga and the Māori King movement has emerged. There's a growing crisis, and an obvious answer to that seemed to be, why not recognise the right of the Kingitanga to manage their own affairs under Section 71? It's sitting there in our constitution, we can do that. But as I say, governors weren't willing to do that. They ignored that. Because it took 6 to 8 months for correspondence to get back and forth from London, the Colonial Office didn't feel that they could tie the hands of governors by issuing specific instructions or orders to do that. So they left that to the discretion of the people on the ground in New Zealand, and they chose to ignore that. And that was, I think, a critical turning point, because that Parliament that meets for the first time in Auckland in 1854 becomes a vocal lobby group for settler interests, and Māori are excluded from that completely until 1867. And this is at a critical juncture in New Zealand history through that period, through the late 1850s and early 1860s.
Oh, there's so many elements of that I'd like to draw out, but and I hope we can on another occasion. But I'd like, given our time constraint, to ask you to go back to that to the tweet I referenced in the opening around your reflections on the Treaty Principles Bill. Just can you talk us through your reaction as you read that document? Well,
as I said, it bears no relationship to the actual contents of the treaty, because it's based on the notion that the treaty was signed between the Crown and all New Zealanders. It wasn't. It was signed with Māori. And there are two ways of looking at this. On the one hand, you could say that David Seymour and the ACT Party more broadly are profoundly ignorant around New Zealand history and what took place, or they're being incredibly disingenuous and cynical about it. I'll leave that for you political commentators and your listeners to determine which answer to that. But either way, it bears no relationship to what the treaty was about.
Okay, I really want to just go back for the audience that for members of the audience that haven't read a lot about this or haven't looked into it. I just want to go back to your point here. In 1840, right, when somebody said New Zealander, what did they mean?
They meant Māori. Simple as that. There was no other context in which that phrase was used in 1840.
What about 1860?
Even then, I mean, I think it's not really until the late 19th century that the term New Zealander is being used for Pākehā as well.
And in terms of the mainstream, for a lot of people, I think World War One might have been the sort of a key around that period. Might have been it. Do you think?
Early 20th century, you've got this sort of burst of nationalism, and people are starting to embrace that identity. It's still a dual identity because they still identify as British and part of the British Empire, but they also see themselves as proud New Zealanders. But certainly not in 1840. Europeans didn't consider themselves that way. They didn't describe themselves as New Zealanders. The term was solely applied to Māori.
So when the ACT Party begin with that anachronistic premise, what does that mean for the credibility of the document altogether?
Well, I mean, it has no credibility. For example, Article 2, the statement in that document, the New Zealand government will honour all New Zealanders in the chieftainship of their land and property. That's just ridiculous. The chieftainship. What are they referring to there?
Look, you're the historian. I'm the political commentator. I think it's just a dog whistle, and there will be some that will interpret it in terms of the term that is often used, and that's individual citizen sovereignty, and that's often used as guised by white extremists, particularly in the USA. I think perhaps purposeful. But Vincent, one of the questions that I want to ask is the preamble is very clear in my perspective, and that is that it's an agreement between the Crown and Rangatira on behalf of their hapu and iwi. Given the fact that it's an agreement between those two parties, how can you alter in any shape or form the original terms without the agreement of the parties involved, and that is the hapu and iwi? Because it's very clear that hapu and iwi are not supportive of this bill. They want to have they want to have a kōrero, they want to contextualize it, but they want to also have an understanding of the historical nature and being of the treaty, and they also want to understand what the actual problem is in 2024. And I think that's what we're struggling. And I think that's what we're struggling. Where is the problem here, folks?
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, you're absolutely right. One party to a treaty can't unilaterally change the terms of it. Both parties have to agree to that, and that hasn't happened. And so, it is essentially an attempt to rewrite the treaty unilaterally. Yeah. And I'm sure I think a lot of Māori probably would have no objection to having a conversation about the treaty, because that's actually healthy. If people learn about it and what it means, and its importance for us today, and what that means in practical terms, that's a good thing. But as I don't know whether this is the way to go about having that conversation. There are lots of much healthier and more honest ways, I think, to have that conversation.
If they're interested in a conversation, and David Seymour insists that he is, and at the same time is insisting that he's really all about protecting liberal democratic values, which to my understanding does not include the unilateral rewriting of treaties. In fact, I would have thought if there's anything antithetical to liberal democracy, it's that. The brute force of majoritarianism, is not what liberal democratic thinkers that Seymour was talking about had in mind, I suspect. But you're not going to have a meaningful, productive discussion if it begins with, as you say, either an ignorant or a or a misleading, anachronistic interpretation of the history of the treaty to begin with. That's a bad faith beginning to any kind of discussion you might like to have. Right?
Yeah, I mean, it's not the basis upon which any such conversation should be initiated. That's for sure.
Yeah. Tell us a bit more about the work you did with the effort, as you said, led by Jacinda Ardern and announced in 2019 to introduce New Zealand. I think most countries in the world would be stunned that we don't do this already, by the way. But to have New Zealand education incorporated into the curriculum. And where do you think that stands with this new government?
Well, the government has announced that the new histories curriculum, I think, will be reviewed for balance, quote unquote, and I'm not quite sure what that means. Maybe,
I do. I know what it means. Yeah.
Maybe we're only allowed to tell rose-tinted versions of our history from now on and ignore anything darker. But to me, that defies the whole purpose of having it. And, one of the things I've always argued is that, we just need to be upfront and honest about our history and ourselves, who we are, where we've come from. And the ironic thing is that it was young people who called for that. The Aotearoa College students who led the movement for New Zealand history to be taught in all schools, and it was just the adults holding them back basically and saying, no, we can't do it. We've got this neoliberal education model where all schools decide what they teach and we can't have centralized curriculums and all that kind of stuff. But it's just, the purpose of engaging with that history is, I think, it's part of that process of genuine healing and reconciliation if we can be upfront and honest about our past, warts and all. And this kind of attempt to hide it, to run away from it, to conceal it, it's not healthy, it's not good, it's not mature. And, to me, the decision to teach New Zealand history in all schools was, as I say, longer term was going to be hugely significant because it would mean that we could have those genuine conversations, genuine dialogue around, our country, where we've come from, and not in a way that's kind of defensive or awkward about it, but just being upfront about, look, some really terrible stuff has happened in our history, and we're actually grown up, so we can face up to that history and we can have those conversations because they're part of that process of healing. Because, for the last 30 or 40 years, we've had this treaty settlements process between the Crown and iwi, but other New Zealanders haven't been part of that conversation.
Yeah, totally.
Often they've had no clue of the history because they didn't learn it at school. So, the ability to engage with that history, to learn it so that we can be a nation in future that is empowered with that knowledge of where we come from. And, to me, that's hugely significant in all kinds of ways. I mean, one of the things that learning history does is it gives you those critical thinking skills. Yeah. You learn not just in terms of historical facts, but, across the board, you can see through things. You get to analyze information, its reliability. You ask questions like, can I verify this by information from elsewhere? What's the context in which the source was generated? All those sorts of basic questions that historians ask. You learn to think critically about matters and to look at something like Acts Treaty Principles Bill and say, well, no, that's not accurate.
You drive a truck right through it. There seems to be. Sorry, Shane. I just want to quickly follow up on one thing. There seems to be a view among, critics of a more open approach to our history, where they feel that they, as Pākehā in New Zealand, if there are harsh or difficult or violent or upsetting aspects, that it's somehow blaming then that they are being asked to take responsibility for acts that occurred, outside of their control hundreds of years ago. I've never actually heard anyone say that that's the case, pointing the finger at anyone else. But there seems to be this sense that it's a threat to their integrity, or it's accusing them of being racist or something. Like I don't quite understand that. It baffles me, but it's ubiquitous. You see it in the US, the UK, everywhere. It's let's avoid talking about history so we don't feel our status threatened or something. I don't quite know. Do you understand what's going on there?
Yeah, so I think a big part of it is people think that they're being made to feel guilty or ashamed for the actions of their ancestors, and they weren't responsible for it, and so on. But the purpose of engaging with this history, I mean, it's not to make people feel guilty or ashamed about what their ancestors did. It's really just to say that we acknowledge this history now. We accept that, and having done that, we can have these healthy conversations around what that means for our society today, and the kind of society that we aspire to be in future. And that is based in kind of genuine dialogue around that history. But in order to have that, you need to be upfront and honest about it first of all, not this rose-tinted version of the history.
And there have been acts of huge good faith from iwi as a result of settlements, and we're looking at 1 or 2 cents in the dollar. But I live in here at Tamaki Makaurau. I look out my office window, and I can see Mangawhau. This was an iwi that were burnt out of their land twice within a 100-year period, negotiated through a grueling 20-year process, the Ngāti Whātua settlement. One of the key components was the rangatira tanga ship, for want of a better term, but actually quite accurate, of the maunga. What was their first act? They handed it back to the people. And there are other instances of this. But Vincent, I want to talk about, if in what limited time we've got left, is the importance of the Waitangi Tribunal. It's been under attack of late. How important is the tribunal in terms of a venue for venting the frustration, for venting the pain, but also working out some sort of a common plan?
Yeah, well, the Waitangi Tribunal has been hugely important, and it was established at a time in 1975 when you had Ngā Tamatoa emerging. You had the start of the sort of annual protests at Waitangi and so on, and in a way, the tribunal was a way of diffusing a lot of that protest.
Yes, absolutely.
And, without it, things potentially could have been a lot uglier, because it provided a forum to hear those grievances, to make recommendations. The Crown was still had the ultimate say, and it's over the years it's rejected many findings of the tribunal if it doesn't like them. But Māori have at least had their day in court. They've had the ability to present evidence to the tribunal, and for the tribunal to confirm that more often than not, to confirm that their understanding of that history is correct. And that's been hugely powerful.
Yeah, it seems to be a massive misunderstanding that the tribunal makes the legislation and that has some form of political power. It doesn't, of course. It allows the process for a hearing to take place and recommendations that go back to Parliament.
That's right. I mean, the binding powers that the tribunal have are very, very limited. There are some SOE lands that it can order the compulsory return of, but that's a very, very rare process. Most of the time, the tribunal simply issues recommendations, and usually in terms of the major historical claims, its recommendations are usually just that the Crown and iwi should go away and settle those claims. They prefer not to issue detailed recommendations to bind the hands of those parties. So, but the parties have a Waitangi Tribunal report that they can take to the Crown to refer to as confirmation that a lot of their grievances have been investigated by the tribunal and found to be valid.
Yeah. Look, we're just on 30 minutes. We're very grateful for the time you've given us. We could go on for hours. And there's so many more things I want to ask you, and I hope I can do that in the future. But Shane, I think we'll wind up now by saying we'll be keeping a close eye. I know I will, and Shane, on the progress of this rollout of a New Zealand history into the school curriculum, and we'll be looking for signals as to whether that's going to proceed as you and others had imagined it, or whether there's going to be some kind of Florida legislature type intervention to try and manipulate that, and because that could be that could be worse than no outcome at all if we don't keep an eye on that. So we'll all be vigilant on that front, and I know you will be. Just finally, what are you working on at the moment? Have you got anything coming up that people should know about?
Well, so 2016, I released a big book called The Great War for New Zealand on the Waikato War, and this year I've got a much shorter history of the Waikato War, a more accessible account of that history for people who don't want the 700-page version. So this, probably about a third of the length of that book. So we're putting that together at the moment.
And when do you expect that to come out? That would be fantastic. I hope
think
Christmas.
I think it's been released during this year.
Oh, great.
Also, Vincent, well, I've got you online and talking along similar parallels. The excellent work you do with Mihi Forbes and Annabelle Lee Mather, that really brings to life in real terms the New Zealand Wars. My kids watch it with fascination, and as do their classmates. So I want to thank you and congratulate you on that. And I keep on stirring my mate Mihi up and Annabelle. I wouldn't mind them doing some work of similar nature on the Mongo Pohatu. I think it'd be fascinating. But thank you for that work, Vincent. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And thanks very much for your time, Vincent.
Okay.
All the best.
Great.
Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Kia ora and welcome everyone. I'm here with Shane, and we're very delighted to see our old mate Willie Jackson, the Honourable Willie Jackson. I think you're joining us from Parliament House today. Is that right?
Yeah, kia ora korua. Yeah. We just finished question time in the house, and then I was just taking a couple of guests around. It's funny when you're not in government anymore, you get a bit more time, eh? So I was taking this young girl around whose birthday it was, and she's loved. It was a big thing just to come to the house. So if you can take a half an hour out with them, and now that we're in opposition, I noticed Grant Robinson was doing the same thing too. May as well, because if it's a big deal for these kids, well, why not give them a bit of a treat? I took her in to meet Chippy, then she met Grant, met Carmel. It was a big thing for her,
when I was 14, weird 14-year-old that I was, that would have been my idea of heaven.
Oh, well, this kid wants to be the Prime Minister, so, you gotta...
Gotta start somewhere.
I was a little bit older when I had my first sort of formal trip to Wellington, and I was hosted by your whanaunga and a very good friend of mine, Koro Wekere. And he said, normally I would take people to for kai at the parliamentary at Bellamy's, but I've got a boil up for you, Shane, and for the others that have come. So I remember it well, Willie. I remember it well.
He was whanaunga to Mum.
Yes.
Cousin to Mum. One of the more Longy said to me, actually,
yes.
Shane. Longy said to me, and I knew David reasonably well because he was our local MP. I knew David from about the age of 17. He always said to me, Koro was one of the more underestimated Māori MPs. Like the media made a bit of fun of Koro,
yes.
But he knew his stuff, with regards to Te Ao Māori, Shane.
He sure did. And Willie, let's talk about Te Ao Māori if we can. I, like you, were at Tūranga Waiwai a few weeks ago. Willie, it was a hui like no other.
It was a hui like no other. It was a fascinating hui because here's the thing: who gets 10,000 people to a meeting? It's incredible. And I didn't think they'll get that many, but it shows you the amount of concern in terms of the Māori community, right? It shows you also the strength of kingitanga, which is been built on. People get confused about kingitanga, but kingitanga was about a protest and was set up because of land confiscation and the people fighting for our land and it was it's actually a protest, been a protest movement, but it gets lost in the whole King Queen sort of area. So that's why I've always been quite a supporter of Kingitanga. I'm not so much a supporter of the Queen or King or anything like that. I believe in a republic and that's where but in terms of that Kingitanga, I support that kaupapa because it's got there's a unifying aspect to Kingitanga. They know how to bring people together. So I was quite proud to see that crowd turn up. Now it's going to be interesting to see what rolls out from that.
Because not only the numbers, Willie, but the huge diversity. We had former national prime ministers, governor generals. We had ministers. Some current ministers. Labour had a good attendance there. But just the diversity, I was talking to one of our my contemporaries in his mid-50s, first time that he's ever been to Hui. He just recognised the significance of the calling of the event, but also, Willie, the work that we as Te Ao Māori need to do, not only as a result of Tūranga Waiwai and from and moving forward. So, Willie, where do you think this is going to take us?
I think, we saw what happened at Waitangi, which was good, and I like the way our people have conducted themselves. I'm not sure that it's going to be so peaceful in Waitangi. I'm not sure where that's going to go. Because my experience, and I've been going to Waitangi for many, many years. I first went to Waitangi in 1984. No, that was the second time I went, but my first significant protest visit was in 1984 when they had a hikoi to Waitangi. So I was about 22, 23. And that was a great hikoi, and all my relations and friends were involved in it. And I've seen what's happened at Waitangi. And you'll recall, Shane, 20 years ago, when that Waitangi basically exploded around Helen Clark, when JT and them were ministers and that, or just about to become ministers. I think Dover was what we were talking about, Dover being a minister around that time. But 20 years or so back, when they exploded and they had to put the security ring around Helen Clark, it was getting dangerous. It was getting violent, actually. And they were wanting to have a real crack at Labour then, because Labour had sort of backed away, as you recall, from closing the gaps and that sort of thing, Shane. And JT always tells me how aggressive and how it was, it was lucky nobody got really badly hurt that day. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen, but if they can turn like that on a Labour government, who knows what they're going to do with this government, with this coalition? I just don't know where this is going to go.
But it's something, Phil, Phil,
no, go ahead,
it's something that we've spoken about Phil, in the past, and I've written about. And one of the reasons is, Willie, is that we've taken the political heat out of the issue, and we've moved it to settlements, to the tribunal, and it's been a vehicle by which our people can vent, but in a constructive way. But to put the issues of the principle and actually the basis of the treaty back on the political agenda, you're almost welcoming the fight, aren't you, Phil?
Yeah, well, it seems completely gratuitous. Like what it's responding to what exactly? What's that apart from the egos of certain Pākehā men of a certain age? What's been hurt here? What's the harm? In fact, I think to the contrary, most people can see that, as you say, taking treaty-related issues off the hot stove of combative politics has been to the great benefit of this country, everyone who lives here, and all the jabbering you hear from Seymour and others, I don't hear any account of any harm to anyone. But there's plenty of benefit. This is purely gratuitous political grandstanding. It won't end up, we hope, in legislation. But even if it doesn't, it's one of the most reckless pieces of political vandalism, parading around in the person of Seymour as some kind of quasi-intellectual defender of liberal democratic value. It's beyond a joke.
Yeah, you're so right, Phil. Yeah.
And I just want to. I was going to ask both of you actually, if you were to, because you were both lucky enough to be at Turanga Waewae, and it was obviously an extraordinary gathering. What if you had to sort of? I mean, this is a multi-front kind of engagement from this government vis-a-vis Māori. You've got the treaty principles bill, then you've got the grandstanding over the te reo use. Then you've got issues around Māori health, as well as other threats to services. How would you rank them in terms of sentiment out there? Is it the treaty principles bill that's got people up in arms, or is it is it a broader picture?
Willie?
Oh, I think it's not just the treaty principles bill, and I think Tainui have already gone to the High Court, haven't they, Shane? In terms of
they have.
Te Reo Māori. I think it feels like an attack on Māori. That's what it feels like, Phil. Right across the spectrum, It does. We did a lot of hard yards in the last 6 years in terms of Māori. Now I always say, I think we all agreed, Phil. Shane's told me this before. Our mistake was we probably didn't explain it well enough. We didn't have our senior Pākehā leaders come to the table enough to explain things, and so that might have been our mistake. But I reject the view that the most New Zealanders were upset and twisted about Māori issues. I totally reject that. And all our target groups, focus groups over the last 6 years, it never came in the top 5. It wasn't even near the top of people's worries. It was always cost of living. It was always housing. It was always health. It was always education. That's what I kept saying. Seymour and them are overcooking this, and they're trying to make it. Most Kiwis are good, Phil. Particularly our younger ones. They want younger Pākehā people want to learn the language. You go to the Wānangas, more Pākehā are learning Te Reo Māori than Māori. You go to Wānanga Aotearoa. So I always say, no, there's not this huge concern about co-governance and all that. They're just overcooking it. Yes, there are some concerns, but those concerns are jumped on by the press. So you get this idiot bachelor who gets focused on, and it's nothing. And Winston and them have cooked. Winston and them cooked it up too, because he had to get across 5. He had to get past 5%.
He would never have got over that 5% fence mark if he had not used that card, Willie.
He used that card. He used the conspiracy card. And so they always, is there prejudice and racism in this country? Of course. Is it en masse and all that? I think New Zealanders have got a lot to be proud of. I've walked the streets and nobody's ever rushed up to me and said, "Oh, you're a separatist." People talk like that when on the Facebook, but I've never had anyone front up to me, Phil, and say that sort of thing. In fact, they always come up and go, "Thanks, we love the Matatini Kapahaka. We're so proud of Matariki Day." And I think there's a lot to be proud of in this country, and that's why if you go back to 87, this is what I'm trying to say to people. You want to open up a can of worms, then revisit what Lord Cook talked about in 87. He took a pragmatic view in terms of the treaty. We all know this. Shane's relations and my relations, our staunchest ones, they didn't want a legal judge's view in terms of right for us to live well together. This is akin to a partnership. They didn't want to hear those words, Phil. All they wanted to hear was Maori run the show. This is about single unity. That's what my Uncle Sid Jackson wanted. That's what my Uncle Moana Jackson wanted. And then you had the extremists on the Seymour camp who said no, nothing at all. You got these legal guns who said, look, we got to live together. Okay. Did the treaty say it was Did they say it was a partnership when on the day that it was signed? Of course they didn't. But it's the judge's view. Judges are paid to interpret legislation, law, history, and they said it was akin to a partnership. I thought it was a brilliant compromise in '87. and because they had to placate, they had to find a way for New Zealand to work together, Fox?
Yeah.
And
I think and the compromise
Yeah.
on the part of iwi
yeah,
is never addressed.
that's
And
right.
yet, I mean, honestly, it's like
Yeah.
Radio Pacific talkback callers from the late 80s have
Yeah.
come back to life. You know, it's like
Oh.
you clowns. You think that Māori are somehow leveraging the treaty instead of Māori in this country have sacrificed and compromised as far as you could possibly expect them to under the terms of the treaty, and these fellas who have no harm to point to, as I say, no skin off their nose, no beach house off their books. You know, these guys are doing fine. They're embittered. They're angry about the world moving past them. They don't understand, you know, all the changes that have happened, and they think, well, how about a good old-fashioned dose of Māori bashing?
I like to tell this story. You know, the reality is that settlements are about 1 or 2 cents in the dollar. You know, so they're hardly greedy, but tiny. But let's look at where I live here in Tamaki Makaurau. Ngāti Whātua burnt off their land, literally burnt off their land twice. They entered into a 20-year settlement process. Part of the settlement was ownership of the maunga. What was the very first act? They gave it back to the people of Tamaki Makaurau.
Of course.
You know, hardly a selfish act. But Willie, you've been in the house today. Tell us about, do you think there is a bit of a chasm between Seymour and Luxon? Because at the end of the day, this is a lot of political capital that Luxon will be burning up. Do you think there is a bit of a chasm, bit of a disagreement in terms of purpose and where this heads between the coalition partners?
Well, you would have seen the news today. It was fascinating, and I questioned Tamapōtaka today. The Greens were questioning the Prime Minister, so we're all going down this track. Māori Party too. But you would have seen today Luxon come out and was very clear. There is a partnership, right? He came out and he said there was a partnership. He put it on the table, and that was a real kick in the guts for Seymour, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And I think he did that after Seymour's carry on over the weekend, you know. And he said this is what he said today. This is how governments have worked before, and this is how we will work. You know, the madness coming from Seymour. It's Trump-like stuff, you know. It's like it doesn't matter. Like he makes out like Lord Cook and all the different lawyers were like Bush lawyers. You're talking the best legal minds of the 20th century in New Zealand.
It's a dead giveaway with the language choices he makes. Activist judges. Yeah. You know, that's unelected bureaucrats. This is
but it's their job to interpret. This is their job. Yeah. You know, why did they do that? Because you wouldn't trust politicians. You know, judges have trained all their lives to say, no, this is how New Zealand has to operate going forward. And every government has adapted and embraced what those judges have said. Because we had the treaty settlements process in '96, and not, you know, the first settlements, and for better or for worse, our people bought into it because we had nothing else, you know. And as you say, Shane, and you say too, Phil, you know, they came about because of the judges' decisions. We you know, you talk about Tainui, 170 million, Ngaitahu the same. Ngaitahu settlement, I reckon, was worked out to $16 to $18 billion, you know. But we embraced the system. We got on board, and now you get this mongrel Seymour who wants to, you know. I thought, you want to change the system, mate. You know, you be careful for what you wish for, because some of our staunchos, like some of our Māori Party relations, they don't buy the partnership model at all either. You know. No. They don't buy it. You've heard JT and them saying, "Hey, we want to run the whole show," you know. And what, you know?
Yeah, no, I get all of that, Willie. And sorry, can I? But also, what concerns me is not only their social policy and their treaty policy, but I'm particularly concerned about their economic policy. You know, they've made it very clear that one of the tools that they want to get a better economy, and it never works. Making people poorer never works, but is to increase unemployment. And what we do know is that 5.5% general unemployment means 12% for Māori. The same number for Pacifica, if not more. And we get to that point when that happens, we get to the point as we did in the 80s and 90s when we have, not only do we have current unemployment, but we have generational unemployment. And, you know, it took our people 30 years to recover from Rogernomics and euthanasia, Willie.
Absolutely. Well, you also say, that's why I want to chase Luxon on his carry on in terms of Māori have never been worse off. What a load of rubbish. You know, we had the best employment stats in the last few years for Māori in history, Shane. The best employment stats and the lowest unemployment for Māori. You know, we've got Māori housing programs put in place. The thing is, as you both know, you've got to put the structure in place and the investment. And of course, once you start doing that, you will see the change. And we were starting to see that slowly. Now they're going to break down those structures. They're going to break down that investment, and we'll be back to base one again, you know. So they just cherry pick. But I know you have to get change, because over the last 3 years, we were negotiating $1 billion a year in terms of investment, in terms of targeted Māori funding, you know. And we've,
you know, and the tragedy here, guys, is that progress that you're talking about, Willie, halting as it is, imperfect as it is, was nonetheless real and meaningful in people's lives. And when that trajectory is reversed, when a government like this one decides tax cuts for the already well-off are more important than maintaining the trajectory of a more expansive and inclusive economy for everyone, that progress can be lost in the blink of an eye.
In a blink of an eye.
And that's the tragedy of this, because it's completely, I mean, you might argue, I'm not going to do it, but you might argue that there was some public policy rationale for some of the harsh measures in the 80s and early 90s. Maybe. I question that. But you might argue that. It's a viable argument.
Yeah.
There is no viable argument to defend an austerity, load up the already loaded approach to economic policy. All they're doing is delivering on election promises, because this Prime Minister doesn't have the sideways movement, doesn't have the deftness to get himself out of these cul-de-sacs, as Andrea Vance put it, I thought beautifully on the weekend. The cul-de-sacs he's finding himself over and over again on these issues. And he doesn't have the wherewithal, the ability that a Bill English had or a John Key had to move with the change. You know, I'm talking about Nats though. This guy, it's all about setting goals and, you know, getting ahead, reading self-help books, you know, believing in the mission. You know, the regional sales guy. The regional sales guy doesn't have the sideways movement you need to be an effective steward of the economy. And he's putting things at threat that have no business being under any threat. That's what I find infuriating about it.
Willie, I just want to talk to you about how the coalition government proceeds from here. And, you know, certainly brought in a hell of a scrap that I don't think I haven't seen in 20 years with iwi, particularly the formal leadership. I think the more established leadership have had to get on board. Not only is the right thing to do, but I think the rangatahi want that, and they will push their leadership, which I think is a good thing. But Willie, how do you dismiss the role and place of iwi at a macro level in terms of the treaty, and then try to work with them at a micro level in terms of delivery of programs, as Minister Pōtaka has said he wants to do? How can you balance the two, Willie?
Yeah, well, that's a challenge for Tama, isn't it? So, you know, he's a good man, Tama. He's probably the best they've got, because he came from the iwi, you see. So it's a really tough task for Te Ao Māori, Shane? Because you know, we don't have no choice in many ways, because you've got a government that you either deal with or you constantly war with. So you're running two strategies, and you would have seen Tainui sort of doing that too, because if we really want to be honest in terms of the Kingitanga end result, it wasn't like there wasn't a set sort of strategy at the end, was there? They didn't put any ultimatums in terms of the government. It was quite the great thing was the kotahitanga and the unity, but there wasn't a Kingitanga declaration, was there?
Right.
Which said, by this time, if you don't do this, this is going to happen, So I sort of thought that was quite a safe thing that they were doing at the end. I'm interested.
As usual, iwi standing up to be the grown-ups. Iwi standing up to be the grown-ups in the room.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And iwi making the compromise. I mean, Tama Potaka is responsible for one of the most, who I have no issue with at all. I think, as you say, he's one of their best. But when he had to say, when asked, is this a white supremacist government? His answer was mind-blowing to me. He said that would be premature.
Yeah.
Now, this is a member of that government saying that it's maybe a bit soon to call them white supremacists. I mean, that talk about that went straight into my media trading folio. That was gold. But I think he couldn't bring himself to disavow his own people in the face of pretty stark evidence that if they're not white supremacists, they're playing fast and loose and recklessly with stuff they clearly don't understand.
Yeah, well, I think Seymour's got them over a barrel, hasn't he? That's the thing. And I'm wondering how he's going to take things now, given that I think Luxon has really made it very, very clear now, hasn't he? Or it's clear, to say today that he sees the treaty akin to a partnership. I put it to him in the House today, and to Tama Potaka, and mind you, he never answers questions, Tama. And I think that he'll reiterate that at Waitangi. So it's going to be interesting. See, I see this coalition government as vulnerable. I do see it because it's, it's not a national government. You see, you've got Winston, such a strong character, so strong in terms of getting his way. And while I give him his dues in terms of getting across the line, because you have to, Winston's not the same Winston of years ago. And so I think as he comes to the end of his tenure, there'll be an Achilles heel there because he won't want to be out of the limelight. I think Seymour, these characters. It's going to be fascinating to watch how they operate. So whilst we all talk about 9-year governments, as we know, everybody says a national government's always 9 years, and that's true. But this is not just a national government, is it?
No, this is not your dad. This is not your dad's National Party, right? And the other aspect of that is that they're trying to pull off something that arguably nobody can pull off. They're trying to be populist rebel rousers, right? And technocratic, born to rule centrist. Now, you try to do both, you piss everyone. You end up to anyone. That's the tension. I can't see them. I mean, that post cab with Judith Collins and Winston. I mean, they couldn't even own up to their own foreign policy. They can't speak in clear sentences. They resorted to the worst kind of technocratic doublespeak the whole way through it, and then the next minute they're throwing out red meat, to the base. Like pick a side, pick a genre. They're trying to work within two genres where just your good old fashioned National Party, you can trust us on the one hand, and we're populist rebel rousers as well. The two can't coexist. And they have to resolve that tension somehow.
I think it was very telling, Winston, that Willie, that Winston took the deputy leadership first time round. I think he will want some distance. He will want some independence. I think if he was to play 2017 all over in his head again, he wouldn't remain as close to the Prime Minister and to the Labour government as he did. But Willie, we're sort of running out of time.
Yeah.
We've had 2 resignations, Calvin Davis and Renal Tedekatne. Tell me about your thoughts about those two and the role that they played in Māori and New Zealand politics.
Renal's a lovely bloke, I've been trying for the last few days to get him to do an interview or He wouldn't
Is he
do a
going to do a valedictory?
no valedictory. He said he doesn't want no valedictory. He said to me that his grandfather died or something, so he couldn't do one, and his auntie Fetu, well, she didn't do one because she got knocked out. But I said, well, you should do one for the legacy of the Tirikatini father.
Yes.
But of course, he said no, and then he said he wasn't doing any interviews, so he's done no interviews, and then he won't even come and have a couple of beers with us. Nothing against us. He's just a humble man.
Yeah.
He's a very humble guy, yeah.
Me and Grant Robertson and I were talking about it, and we thought that sounds Renoir. He's a lovely man. I'll get him here for a few drinks eventually in the next couple of weeks. But he was always a quiet contributor and a lovely man. Always had a good head, lovely personality. Just low profile, but had a lot of support from people at the coalface. So he'll be missed. And in terms of Calvin. Yeah. Calvin has to be acknowledged. His valedictory is tomorrow night. The first Māori deputy leader of the Labour Party, could have been the deputy prime minister if he wanted it, walked away from it, didn't want it. That was his humility kicking in. But a quiet leader in his own right. I really supported Calvin, and I've really, he's been a good mate. When I first came into the Labour Party, as you two remember, I think both of you were against me when I first came in. I'm trying to remember. I'm sure I read your column somewhere. Bugger off, Jack, you're too old or some bloody thing. Calvin
that was him. Wasn't me. Wasn't me.
I was wrong. I admit it.
Yeah, Calvin was one of the few who supported me, 100%. Yeah. I never forget that support and loyalty, and I made to him for his, he's been a quiet but very capable leader, and I'm looking forward to his valedictory, and I thank him for all his support and loyalty to me, Shane.
I think that his recognising that the imprisonment numbers were just continuing, and that it was Māori by and large that being imprisoned, and that we had to find an alternative. Many people have jumped on that as a sort of an anti. And want more prisons, but I actually think that he shifted the argument, and I think that was very important. Yeah, very important.
He's passionate. Calvin was never he was never one of the greatest communicators, I suppose. And I don't mean to be critical of him, because he lost his temper quite a bit with the media, but he was passionate. And when he was in a settled state, because he was a bit uncomfortable with some of mainstream media and they were reading him wrong. He was a very good advocate, and he loved advocating for our people in the prisons and at iwi level, where he did some really significant work. So
he gave great conference speeches too, reliably.
Yeah.
Great conferences. Yeah.
And here's the other thing: is both of them could have stuck around, but they want to do something different, and it allows others to come in, and it allows others to come in. So, and I think that is simply it personifies the type of people that both Calvin and Reno are. Hey, Willie, thanks very much for the call today. Really interesting time. I was of two minds about coming up to Waitangi, but I think it's the hui that cannot be missed. I look forward to it. Kia ora, Willie. That's the Honourable Willie Jackson. Thank you for your time today.